Okay, we've been talking about the Constitution, and before we moved on, I wanted to bring something to your attention and maybe have a discussion about it. So, I'm going to leave it up to you guys. You can go over the slideshow here, or watch this presentation, and then do the assignment at the end, or you can meet with me on the Google Hangouts, and we'll talk about it together. It's up to you guys. The question we're going to answer today, or try to answer, is: was the U.S. Constitution defective from the start? Before we can answer that question, or attempt to answer that question, we need a little background. The first thing we're going to talk about is a man named Thurgood Marshall. Okay, he's passed away, but at one time he was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, and he served from October 1967 to October 1991. He was the very first African American to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. If you'll remember, the Constitution was written in 1787. So in 1987, the Constitution had turned 200 years old, and we were going to celebrate, that it was 200 years old and was still in effect, and we were still using it to run our country. And Thurgood Marshall wrote a paper called Reflections on the Bicentennial of the United States Constitution. And there were some things in there that he wrote that he took issue with the Constitution. And one of those things that he said was he thought that the Constitution was defective from the start. And these are pretty important things that he brought up, and I thought it would be a good time for us to discuss these in a little bit of detail and get your opinion on them. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to read certain excerpts that actually apply to what we've been talking about in the Constitution, because I think it's important that we discuss it in detail. Okay, so it starts out with: I cannot accept this invitation, for I do not believe that the meaning of the Constitution was forever fixed at the Philadelphia Convention. Now, if you remember, they met in Philadelphia to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, and they eventually just got rid of them altogether and wrote the U.S. Constitution. So that's where he's referring to as fixed. Then he says, nor do I find the wisdom, foresight, and sense of justice exhibited by the framers particularly profound. In other words, he doesn't think that they wrote such a great thing. It wasn't the genius that everyone thinks it is. To the contrary, the government they devised was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, and momentous social transformation to attain the system of constitutional government and its respect for the individual freedoms and human rights that we hold as a fundamental today. When contemporary Americans cite the Constitution, they invoke a concept that is vastly different from what the framers barely began to construct 2 centuries ago. So what he's saying is, basically, if the Constitution was so great when they originally wrote it, how come we had to fight in a war and make all kinds of amendments and all these other things that had to happen before we got to the Constitution that we actually have today? And he's saying when people celebrate the Constitution, they're celebrating some kind of concept that we have now that we actually didn't have when we first started. So he's saying, basically, what's the big deal? The next part I have here says, for a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution, we need look no further than the first 3 words of the document's preamble, we the people. When the Founding Fathers used this phrase in 1787, they did not have in mind the majority of American citizens. We the people included, in the words of the framers, the whole number of free persons. On a matter so basic as the right to vote, for example, Negro slaves were excluded, although they were counted for representational purposes at 3/5 each. Women did not gain the right to vote for over 130 years. So once again, he's saying we're celebrating a document that did not count African Americans, did not count women as people. They didn't. The women were counted in the population, but they didn't have the right to vote. Negroes were only 3/5, like the Great Compromise. So once again, he's saying we're celebrating this document like it was some kind of profound thing that we should celebrate, and in reality, it was very flawed. He goes on to say, despite this clear understanding of the role slavery would play in the new republic, use of the words slaves and slavery was carefully avoided in the original document. Political representation in the lower house of Congress was to be based on population of free persons in each state, plus 3/5 of all other persons. Moral principles against slavery for those who had them were compromised, with no explanation of the conflicting principles for which the American Revolutionary War had ostensibly been fought. The self-evident truths that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So once again, he's saying that this document conflicts because we say all men are created equal, but we still have slaves, we still have slavery. We don't put it in the document, so there's a part of us that knows that slavery is bad, and we chose not to put it in the document. So the population that we're talking about when we say we the people, and we talk about all men are created equal, that population we're talking about is just free persons. At least that's what his opinion is. He ends his paper with this: some may more quietly commemorate the suffering, struggle, and sacrifice that has triumphed over much of what was wrong with the original document, and observe the anniversary with hopes not realized and promises not fulfilled. I plan to celebrate the bicentennial of the Constitution as a living document, including the Bill of Rights and other amendments protecting individual freedoms and human rights. So what he's saying is, he's not so much going to celebrate the fact that it was written. He thinks the most important thing about this document is that it is a living document. In other words, it can be modified, it can be amended. So as time transpires and we realize mistakes we might have made in the past, we can actually amend the document and make those changes to make it a better thing. And this is what we have done for the past 200 years. Today's password is tire. Once again, today's password is tire. So, what do you guys think? Go read over all of this again, listen to what I have to say, come up with your own opinion, and then there is a paper on Google Docs that says, was the Constitution defective from the start? And I want you to write your own opinion if you choose to do that. You also have the option of being in the Google Hangouts and we'll just talk about it. But if you weren't in the Google Hangouts, then you must do the Google Doc. Alrighty, hopefully I'll see you in the Google Hangouts. Have a good one.